Broadcasting live from the Business RadioX studios in Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for Buy a Business Near Me. Brought to you by the Business RadioX Ambassador Program, helping business brokers sell more local businesses. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to another exciting and informative edition of Buy a Business Near Me. Stone Payton here with you this morning, and you guys are in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming to the program with the Veld Group, Mr. Ryan Clark. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic, Stone. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you on the show. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. This is a new series on the Business RadioX network, and I can't think of a better way to kick it off than to have you come visit with us. Before we dive in too deep, can you give us just kind of a primer, just a little bit of a background, mission, purpose? What are you and your team really out there trying to do for folks?
Well, for the last, say, 21 years, we've been, listing, selling, and marketing companies on a very high level. Honoring our clients, finding value wherever we can find value for them, and then really managing the process, facilitating the sale. Sort of being their guiding presence, and working with other professionals along with ourselves. There are other advisors, but really managing the human component of the transaction from beginning to end.
So actually, that's one of the very first questions I have. I own 40% of, we've got a pretty good thing going here. And we don't have our exit strategy completely nailed down, but I got to tell you, one of the things that Lee and I have surely absolutely zero clue about is how do you go about valuing your business as you begin to prepare for an exit?
No, absolutely. It's a great question. We started out our firm. We began as a certified valuation firm before we got into brokerage and M&A. Oh. So our background is valuation. I would like to tell you that valuation, you can open up a book and figure out how to value a company, but it's definitely part art and part science. In the end, in most cases, it boils down to ultimately what is somebody willing to pay. And not everybody values the same business the same way, depending on if it's a strategic buyer or somebody who's a little bit doing an acquisition for other purposes, or someone who just wants to buy your company and add on to their portfolio. But in the end, it comes down to some basic principles. There's various valuation methodologies, but ultimately it comes down to profitability and risk. Those are the two where they really meet. And so how risky is this cash flow or this profitability is coming from this company? Risk can be assessed, using multiple variables when it comes to risk. Just company infrastructure, assets, contracts, just really the stability of that cash flow or the revenue that company's generating. So there's all sorts of things when you look at risk. Age of equipment, customer concentration, which could be negative, positive in some cases, where maybe all of your customers are coming from one source, the strength of your supply chain, all these different variables, you kind of evaluate all of them. And then you sort of put a kind of a value overall or a range of value ultimately in that company. How involved is Stone and Lee in the operation? Can anything revolve without Stone and Lee? Can they take a vacation? Or if they're not there, the whole thing crumbles to the ground. I mean, that's a huge risk factor associated with an acquisition, the independence or the autonomy of a certain company.
Well, I'm glad I asked, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I got to believe many of our listeners, gang, that's one of the things you got to think about. If you're serious about an exit and you want to get your organization ready to sell, it can't be dependent on you, right?
Well, it depends on the size of the company. You're right, though, for sure. I will tell you, most companies in the range that we deal with, first thing we do when we're beginning the exit planning process for our clients, it might be 6 months before the exit. It might be 3-4 years before they plan on the exit. But it's really creating a situation where key employees and people besides the ownership, where they're really empowered to perform certain tasks that are going to be valuable in an acquisition for a potential buyer. Because that's what buyers are looking at, depending on the size of the acquisition, whether you're larger, more institutional buyers or private equity, they're going to want people there remaining. They're buying a lot of that human capital, and they want them to remain and the company to be able to carry on without the ownership.
Now, have you found in your experience that the equation is a little different for some industries versus others, or is it just really incredibly individual case scenario?
Absolutely. Both those things are true, right?
Okay.
So it really is going to come down to the individual company. I mean, you could have two businesses in the same industry that will trade at completely different multiples, right? So it's not really industry specific. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's kind of where the risk, meets the other variables of the business. How risky is this company that I'm taking on? A very low risk business with, say, government contracts and all sorts of stability might trade at a higher multiple than a company who has much more volatility with it, where the expectations are going to be, very different from the person doing the acquisition. They want to get their money back and return on their investment much sooner than somebody who understands that stability and willing to wait it out for maybe 5, 7, 10 years possibly.
Yeah. So I got to know, man, what's the backstory? How did you get involved in this line of work?
Yeah, it's everybody has a story. I started out, after school in financial planning, financial sales, setting up 401ks, selling insurance products, things like that. I've always been pretty good dealing with people, communicating, sending my message. And one of my associates, Michael, founder of the company, he had got back from getting his MBA at Michigan and said, let's build a company. Let's do something for us. We all had various backgrounds, whether it's CPA, MBA, valuation, sales. And we decided to build a firm. We started out, the main focus was helping the small to lower middle market business owner, value their companies correctly, then eventually exit. So it was really about finding our purpose and where could we be the most value. That's why we kind of carved out a segment in the size of transactions that we do. That's a little bit unique, too big for the typical business broker, maybe too small for traditional M&A, where we're really adding value to the business owner, the mom and pop, people with blood, sweat, and tears, 20, 30 years, built a company, and now they want to exit gracefully. So that was really our driving force, was how can we best serve and how can we best help the small business owner? And we found a nice niche.
It must be incredibly rewarding work, man. You must really enjoy it.
Yeah, it is. You know what? It's a little bit of, it's obviously not, it's not for the weak. I'm going to be honest. Selling companies, right? Setting realistic expectations for all sides, managing human beings through a very long emotional process, deal structure, making everybody happy, getting everybody understand perspective. Not the easiest thing to accomplish. I will tell you that. However, when you take a business owner who's built a company, long term, 20, 30 years, not everyone is like this. Some are just, they've owned it for 6 months, but ultimately, they want to exit. But when you take especially that family, that person who's put their life on the line, long weekends, not traveling, doing all the things to build a business and grind it out, to be able to develop a plan to allow them to exit on their own terms, it is a pretty magical thing. Then on the other side, depending on the buyer, if you have a larger institutional buyer, it's a little bit different. But if you have, let's say somebody's getting out of the corporate world, right? High net worth individual who wants to buy a company cash flowing $1 million, $2 million, which is pretty common out here in Southern California, getting them to transition and allowing that transition from that more structured corporate space into a small business and accomplish their dreams, seeing what they're made of. Yeah, it's a pretty magical thing on both sides. And we're the facilitator of that, right? We're guiding people through these processes. We are their psychologists, we're their educator, we're their advisor, we're all the above, right? Talking them on and off the ledge at every turn. But that's part of, our skill set, and that's the skill set that you've been able to create through time.
I love it. Yeah. It just occurred to me while you were talking, and I'm applying a lot of it to me and Lee, right? You might have to be, part therapist, because Lee and I are on the same page on a lot, but when it comes down to this, we may have some very, we're just like a married couple, right? We got this business marriage.
Absolutely. My goal is always to create an atmosphere where all sides work together, right? Try to find a place where everybody's happy. That's not easy, right? To find that happy space for all. And through doing that, you have to understand different people, different cultures, where people come from, personality types, and navigating through that. And that's really, I would say, if there's any skill set you develop over a 20-year career doing 1,000+ transactions, through all that experience, it really is understanding how to help people manage themselves and manage their own emotions, right? Most transactions will fall apart 5, 10, 20 times through the 8.2 months it takes to actually sell a company, right? Even when you're under contract, the deal will fall apart because people will draw a line in the sand. And that is just kind of human nature. Everybody has their limits. And so being able to getting the other side to really understand the other person's perspective and why they feel that way, it takes a lot of skill, a lot of work, having to stand up to your clients, having to do what's right for them, even when maybe through lack of experience, intuitively, they don't really feel like it's right for them. So you have to show them the path and show them the way. And that's why they're engaging us. That's why they're bringing us on in the first place.
Okay, let's talk about me some more. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's my show, right? I'm applying all this to me and Lee, and I think our value system, we're transparent. Our work practices are very transparent, and I gotta say, I don't know that I would want the market to know that we're on the market. Can you do this with some degree of confidentiality, at least in the early stages?
100%. So here's what I will tell you. Almost every business transaction is extremely confidential. The last thing we want, is the word getting out on the street that this company's for sale for whatever reason, for staff, for customers, for suppliers, for vendors. I mean, It's definitely something that you do not want to be known. So most transactions are highly confidential all the way through to the very end. Some potentially could get exposed. You kind of have a game plan in place for that. But, the process is very formal. A typical buyer will reach out to us through one of our various mediums, be funneled to our company. They will complete a 3-page non-disclosure form, confidentiality agreement, and a full financial profile. So now we know who the buyer is, what they do for a living, what they're looking for, interests they have, and the types of businesses looking to acquire. And then at that point, we'll send them out the full comprehensive overview of the company, right? That gives all the granular detail that they're looking for in an acquisition. But at first, they're seeing a generic kind of teaser out there in the open market that doesn't really give it away. Mm-hmm. If it's a radio station, it might say West Coast-based radio station, over 20 markets, nothing specific. It could be a lot of different companies that fit that profile. And then I will say, once they've signed the NDA and they get through that process, the majority of buyers, they're very respectful of the business owner. Most of them own companies. They understand what it's like. They don't want the word to get out, especially if there's a serious acquisition candidate. The last thing they want to do is devalue the company by doing that and let somebody else know that is possibly for sale and get cut out from underneath them. So confidentiality is sort of part of the process. We make sure people understand the reasons why we keep it confidential. And it's written in every email, every correspondence, every disclaimer is that this information I'm providing is for you and not to be shared with anybody else.
So you've mentioned a couple of times, 20 plus years doing this. Have you had an opportunity along the way to have the benefit of some mentors, a mentor or two? And have you, now that you have this experience base, have you taken the opportunity to mentor anyone else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, a lot of my mentors over the years have been, not really direct mentors, right? Just through some of my training growing up, experience being an athlete, coaches, I would say. And then early on in my career, studying a lot, dealing, for instance, someone like, say, Tom Hopkins, who's a sales guru, right? Learning lessons from Hopkins, having the pleasure to play golf with him when I was young, in my early 20s.
Oh, cool.
Reading his books and kind of taking a lot of that philosophy. So as far as direct mentors, this is really interesting. When we got started in this business, we were young. We were in our late 20s, about to be early 30s, and we didn't know a whole lot. And I will tell you through, just really grinding through transactions and learning on the fly, it really helped us develop a system that we were able to perfect. It didn't take a lot of outside influence, to be honest, to really incorporate into the way we do things. Now, we did here and there, but there was really nobody directly that was, say, older than us, more mature, that we just took us under our wing, and we learned from. Now, on the flip side, yes, I mean, take a lot of pleasure in teaching people, giving away a lot of information, coaching people within some of my advisory groups that I'm part of. When you sort of, when you're really engaged in an industry and you kind of know your place in that industry, I think it becomes more common that you're willing to share a lot of insights and a lot of information on what you're trying to get done and how you can help people. Because ultimately that's the goal, right? Is to help people through these situations that they're in and do it the best way possible. So I do give a lot of advice to a lot of attorneys, a lot of accountants, a lot of deal makers, because ultimately they want to know from a real hands-on experience standpoint, how should this transaction go? And they're maybe looking at it a little bit more compartmentalized rather than looking at it holistically from an entire transaction standpoint. We have to be in tune to a lot of the parts of the deal, from the legal side, from the accounting side. While we're not giving legal advice or we're not CPAs, just being aware of the various types of methodologies that people can use and the right kinds of advisors to refer them to.
So I know in our work, there are a handful of, what would you call them, misconceptions, preconceived notions, assumptions. I feel like we approach our whole strategy toward leveraging media to help people and make money a little different. And so I know I can almost anticipate I'm going to run into a handful of some of the same misconceptions, preconceived notions. Are there some common misconceptions about your industry or your business?
You mean just in general I would say from an intermediary standpoint, there's probably going to always be some, right? Because of, misunderstanding the value that we're bringing to the table, right? Ultimately, when we're being brought in on a referral basis from whether it's a wealth manager, financial advisor, ultimately everybody's waiting for this event. And the event typically comes when we bring the buyer to the table and close the transaction. That's when this liquidity event or this major event happens for a lot of different people. So I would say the value of a good intermediary, it's the glue that holds a transaction together. It's the one who's going to kind of guide all sides through this process. Now, yes, can somebody get into this business without a lot of experience and really not have that volume and say I'm an intermediary, I'm a broker, I'm an M&A expert? Of course they can do that, right?
Right.
But to be a seasoned one who's made it through, all of the battles, that this is a tough business to get through. Once you've done it for a long period of time, you've sold maybe 50 to 100 companies and you've been through some of these battles, you definitely have a perspective that is going to be very unique and very different. Now, as far as misconceptions go on the buy and the sell side, absolutely. There's dozens of them, right? The sellers always, well, not always, but will typically want more money than the company is worth.
It's their baby, right?
And the buyer doesn't want to pay as much money as the business is worth. The buyer wants to get it with no money down and seller finance. The seller wants all cash, right? There's all sorts of variables where you have to bring people together and set, realistic expectations, I would say. That's sort of a misconception or not. Getting people who maybe have read a book or two on how to buy a company to understand, that's maybe not necessarily how you buy a business, or what you're going to be left with that type of a business isn't going to be the kind of business that you want to buy. So if you want to buy a good business, there's going to be general rules and principles and the way you got to go about yourself and how you have to handle yourself. One thing I will tell most buyers who come to us always, share a lot of information. Tell us who you are, where you're getting your money from, what you can afford. Give us a snapshot, an accurate snapshot as to who you are. And then we're going to be better help serving you, guiding you in the right direction, and really giving you these opportunities that you may or may not have access to on the open market, transactions and listings that just come in, or an opportunity that we're working on. It's all interaction, right? It's developing a relationship. We're in a relationship business with buyers and sellers and other advisors in our industry. So, ultimately, it's about being transparent and being straightforward and honest. That's the way you're going to get it. That's the way you're going to get what you want if you're a buyer. Developing that relationship. Really common conversation I have with buyers, whether it's dealing with myself or my company or anybody else, find people who sell companies like that you want to buy and develop a good long-term relationship with them. And get them to understand you're an easy person to work with. You're flexible. You're liquid. What you can spend. And once an intermediary understands that part of the equation, then they can help guide you through it. If you're going to be secretive and not tell them who you are, where you're money from, and just kind of demand information, you're not going to get very far in this business. So really having that openness is really the key, I would say, working with buyers.
Well, as you were talking, two things. One, I think you painted, at least for me, the absolute perfect picture that brings it into focus for why it is so important to have someone like you with the specialized knowledge, with the experience base, the expertise, to facilitate that what can be, I guess, sometimes a pretty big gap in the beginning. The other thing that's beginning to dawn on me a little bit, this whole world, when it's done right, is much more relationship oriented, relationship dependent than transactional than I guess I was anticipating. Is that accurate?
Oh, 100%. It really is. And the first comment, yes, I've mentioned the word perspective a few times, and I think you gain perspective through wisdom. You gain wisdom through experience. So I think that as you have perspective and you can share that with people, that's what keeps people on track, right? That's what keeps the buyer and seller moving towards the ultimate goal, because you can share, real true life perspective as what will happen or what could possibly happen if they do go down a road that maybe they're thinking about going down. And that's that's part of the success rate. That's how we sell 82% of our listings historically, our companies.
Wow.
And industry average is about 33%. So yeah, that's, that perspective is a huge part. Now, the second part to your question, I can't remember. Maybe you can refresh my memory on that one.
Well, just relationship. This is a much more relationship oriented than transactional. I guess I had a frame around it that was much more transactional.
No, I will share with you. So we, just recently, we just closed a 27 location fast casual franchisor, represented the franchisor, right? So the franchisor is a brand that I've known, well known out here on the West Coast. However, the seller of the franchisor came to me because I helped them do some acquisitions on another large chain down in San Diego a couple of years back, right? So I developed a relationship with them as a buyer, and then they came back through as a seller. That happens in reverse and backwards and forwards all day long, right? So there might be a company that we help build. We help bring them from maybe one location to 35 locations. And then we're involved in the sale 14 years later. So it is definitely a long-term relationship, not one transaction at a time. You're always thinking big picture. And I think that's how we've survived really 20 years. It's because that is our mentality and everybody knows it. So we're always thinking about down the road and doing the right thing because, this is your lifeblood. And from the seller side, while we represent the seller exclusively in almost every situation, many of them are just one and done. You sell their company, they're retired, they're gone.
Yeah.
That buyer who we don't always represent becomes our seller down the road in the future, and they become a buyer as well. So it's very important to balance this and be very honest and transparent through our process with the buyer and the seller, right? Just because we represent a seller doesn't mean we're going to go along with maybe their antics one way or another, right? We're going to be honest with them. We're going to be straight with them because we know that ultimately it's going to potentially kill their transaction. So we want to be very, straight about that with them and get them on the right track. And that's really where the tough work comes in, getting people to understand your perspective and where you're coming from. It's kind of Dale Carnegie, maybe a mentor of mine, something I learned from him. Right? Yeah. Getting people to understand where you're coming from is really important, and understanding where they're coming from as well.
I got to say, 82 point something % versus down in the 30s. That's what an impressive track record. And I think you've probably at least partially already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's so many of our listeners want to get some insight on this topic. And it's largely my role in my company. But I am curious, how does the whole sales and marketing thing work for a company like yours? It seems like it would be it seems like once you're in a conversation like this, my guess is they sign. If they're, but like that new business, those new relations. Can you advertise? How does that happen?
Yeah, I would tell you, it's interesting. So obviously through, websites, and when you have a lot of companies on the open market, even confidentially through the various marketing mediums that you use to advertise your businesses, people see that, right? Business owners see that. They've inquired on businesses. And when you've been doing it for 20 years, a lot of them have come through our system. We get a lot of sellers who came through our system at some point to try to buy a company. They didn't buy something from us. Maybe they found something different. Maybe they moved on in a different direction. But then they did maybe acquire something, and they remember us. They remembered the process. They remembered the NDA. They remembered the being qualified, and they remembered the level of information that our phenomenal marketing team gave them. And they said, wow, if I ever want to sell my company, I'm giving Veld a call. That's where I'm going to go with. I didn't really care for the guy I bought the business through. I'm going to get through them. So back it up about the 80. Yeah, when you talk about 82%, there's so many factors that go into what's going to give you a high closing ratio, right? The relationship with the seller. I would say before we even get into the industry, Stone, it's about the relationship that you have with the business owner. Is this someone who we want to align ourselves with? Do they have the same, are our incentives aligned with them through this process? If they're just testing the waters, they're not serious about selling, or they're thinking, their expectations are much higher than what we even think the market could eventually bear for them, it might not be worth it for us to engage them and to take them on, right? So we have as much as decision making at the beginning as they do, obviously, right? We can choose if we want to engage them or not. So that's a big part of it. Pricing the companies correctly. Another part of it, making sure they're valued the right way, making sure that ultimately they're sellable, listing the right types of businesses, and then qualifying buyers and really making them go through a process. And then once we get into an LOI or a contract phase, managing that process effectively, putting out fires, keeping plates spinning, all the cliches you want to come up with. That's what gets you and translates ultimately what comes out of the end at an 82% closing ratio. It's not just a simple like, hey, we got a lot of buyers coming in, so we're able to sell a lot. Buyers know how to find us. We're not that difficult to find. It's about getting through a transaction is really where the magic happens, and that's really the value that a real experienced intermediary or broker or M&A advisor is going to really hold that value, not just putting it on a bunch of websites and having people find you. So yeah, a lot to it, in that perspective for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Before we wrap, if you would, let's leave our potential buyers and sellers out there, even people that are just beginning to think about this and want to learn more. Let's leave them with a couple pro tips, just something they should be thinking about, reading, doing, not doing, just a little something they can sink their teeth into it, if you would.
Absolutely. There's a few of them, right? Typically when it comes to value, speak to a professional that sells companies once they start evaluating your company. Don't necessarily just take the advice of some other advisor, your Uncle Louie or somebody like that who says, oh, you probably did this for your company. Speak to someone who does it for a living and then start setting expectations based off of that. So that way you're going into this thing, somewhat realistic, knowing that, okay, if I'm going to sell, this is really what it's for. But, be open with a professional, share financial data with them, be very transparent. The things that keep you up at 2:00 in the morning that you're scared of, make sure they know about that as well. So that way they can find ways to mitigate that. But so these are sort of some very high level suggestions. But when you get in down to like maybe more the meat and potatoes type stuff, organize your financials, make sure you have organized, P&Ls, income statements, balance sheets, tax returns. That's sort of the financial component of it. Make sure you have your financials together because buyers are going to expect to see that. Then from an organizational standpoint, when I mentioned the owner's role in the company, start empowering people maybe to take some of the menial tasks that the owner does, preparing the company a little bit better for an acquisition. Definitely a nice component. And then a third thing I'll say, concentration, depending on the industry. You want to have diverse revenue streams. Sometimes, especially small businesses, it's very difficult to not get stuck in a concentration concern where you're maybe making a product for a large company and you're sort of beholden to them. It becomes very easy to do that. So it's not always a bad thing if their infrastructure is also set up and they're very reliant on you. But I would say in general, having a very diverse income stream where that way maybe not one customer's 15, 20% of your revenue. You keep it down 5, 10%, spread it out. That's going to, most buyers are going to look at that for an acquisition standpoint and think it's going to be more diverse, a more stable, more steady revenue stream. So those are sort of some, tips off the bat. It's really polishing it up, making it a better company, a more refined company before you take it to the open market, because these are the things that the buyers are going to exploit very quickly. They're going to pick them apart, and they're going to look for, real value in some of the nuance that's going to exist within your business.
All right. Okay. So if someone wants to reach out, have a conversation with you or someone on your team, let's leave them with some coordinates, whatever you think is appropriate, whether it's an email, a website, a LinkedIn. But I want them to be able to connect with you and open up a conversation if it makes sense. So let's leave them with some points of contact if we could.
Absolutely. I would say, our website, we have multiple sites. We have our Main Street site, which is the veldgroup.com. More of the M&A focused site where a lot of our energy goes is veldma.com. V is in Victor, E is in Edward, L is in Larry, D is in David, M is in Mary, A is in Apple.com. My personal email is ryan@veldma.com. Our phone number here locally is area code 310-652-8353. 310-652-8353. We have a couple different offices in Southern California. We work with buyers, in some cases, in different parts of the country. Our focus is California, San Francisco, down to San Diego, all through this massive state. But we do work on transactions in other states as well, depending on the licensing.
Well, Ryan, it has been an absolute delight having you on the show. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your insight and your story. This has been informative, inspiring, and a marvelous way to invest a Thursday afternoon, man.
Thank you, Stone. I really appreciate your time as well, and allowing me to share some experience with your audience. And anywhere I can help somebody, feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. If you would stay on the line, I'd like to chat with you for just a moment after, but we're going to tell these folks bye. Okay. All right. This is Stone Payton for our guest today, Ryan Clark with the Veld Group, and everyone here at the Business RadioX family saying we'll see you next time on Buy a Business Near Me.